The clay was cold. It clung to Eno's hands and forearms, a thick, gray glove of earth and water and finely chopped straw. He worked it on a wide plank set across two sawhorses, his palms pushing and folding, his knuckles driving into the dense mass. Beside him, a large, dark dog with intelligent eyes sat on its haunches, its head cocked. The dog's name was Otso, and he watched the methodical rhythm of the work, his tail giving a slow, patient thump against the dusty ground every few minutes. Eno did not look up. His world had been reduced to this task, the mixing of the mortar that would bind his future together. The air was sharp with the coming of autumn, a clean, cold edge that promised an end to the easy days. This was his first season alone in the small cabin his father had built, a solitary box of hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, sitting on a rise of land that overlooked the winding creek. His parents were gone, taken by the fever that had swept through the settlement the previous spring, leaving him with the cabin, 20 acres of stony ground, and a leather-bound journal filled with his father's elegant script and precise, intricate drawings. He scooped a double handful of the finished mortar onto a wooden hawk and carried it to the corner of the cabin where the project was taking shape. It was a monstrosity, a pile of rocks and ambition that had already earned him the derision of the entire valley. He knelt, trowel in hand, and began to lay a new course of stones. Each one was chosen with care, fitted and leveled, the gray mortar squeezed between the joints. Otso patted over and nudged Eno's shoulder with his wet nose, a silent question. Eno paused, resting his forehead against the dog's thick ruff. "It will work," he murmured, the words a familiar promise to himself as much as to the animal. The sound of an approaching horse made him straighten up. Mr. Abernathy, who owned the general store and held the mortgage on half the valley's homesteads, reined in his handsome bay. He was a man whose substance was measured in the crispness of his collar and the shine on his boots. He looked from Eno, caked in mud, to the growing pile of rock that consumed a full quarter of the small cabin's single room, its base already sprawling 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep. "Heikkinen," Abernathy said, his voice carrying an easy, dismissive authority. "I heard you were building something, but I assumed it was a root cellar, or perhaps a tomb. What is this monument to foolishness?" Eno wiped a smear of clay from his cheek with the back of his wrist. "It's a stove." Abernathy chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "A stove? Son, I sell the finest cast-iron stoves west of the Alleghenies. Efficient, modern. They cost $17. This looks like you're trying to build a mountain indoors." "This will be better," Eno said quietly, turning back to his work. He picked up another stone, testing its weight. "Better? How could a pile of mud and rock be better than polished iron? Wait until the first real freeze. That thing will crack to pieces. It'll fill your cabin with smoke. You'll be lucky if you don't burn the place down around your ears." Abernathy shook his head, a gesture of theatrical pity. "Your father was a practical man, Eno. I don't know where you got these fantasies." He spurred his horse and rode on, leaving the scent of leather and superiority hanging in the air. Eno did not watch him go. He laid the stone, tapping it level with the handle of his trowel. The sound was a small, solid punctuation in the quiet afternoon. Later that week, Silas came by. He was their closest neighbor, an old trapper whose face was a roadmap of hard seasons. He leaned his long rifle against the cabin wall and peered inside, chewing on a piece of dried venison. "What in God's name is that, boy?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "A stove," Eno repeated. Silas stepped inside, circling the structure. He ran a hand over the rough field stones. A stove is made of iron. It has a door, a grate, a pipe that goes straight up. This is a pile of rocks. He squinted at the complex channels and openings Aino was forming within the structure's core. You got it all blocked up inside. The smoke's got nowhere to go. It has a place to go, Aino said. It just takes the long way. The long way? Smoke wants to go up, fast. You try and make it go sideways and down, it'll just come pouring back into the room. You'll choke on it in your sleep. Silas shook his head, his expression a mixture of concern and contempt. I told your pa this land was trouble. The winters here have teeth. They'll find every crack in your walls, every flaw in your plan. You need a big fire, a hot fire, roaring all night long. This thing, whatever it is, it won't do it. He pointed a gnarled finger at the construction. That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. You mark my words, boy. Wait until winter. Aino met his gaze. I have a plan. Silas grunted. So does a fool right before he freezes to death. He left without another word, taking his certainty with him. Even Mrs. Gable, a woman whose kindness was a valley institution, brought her doubts along with a freshly baked apple pie. Her brow furrowed with worry as she stood in the doorway, her hands twisting in her apron. Aino, dear, she began, her voice soft. Mr. Abernathy is concerned. Silas is too. We all are. A simple iron stove is all a man needs. It's not too late to tear this down. Your father left you with a little money, enough for a proper stove from the store. Thank you for the pie, Mrs. Gable, Aino said, accepting the warm dish. This will work. Her worried eyes lingered on the stone behemoth, then on his stubborn face. She sighed, patted his arm, and retreated, her concern trailing behind her like a shadow. That night, with Otso asleep at his feet, Aino sat at the small wooden table and opened his father's journal. The lamp cast a pool of warm yellow light on the page. The book was his only inheritance of value, filled with a knowledge that the valley did not understand. His father, a stonemason from a land of long, dark winters, had filled it with notes and drawings over 30 years. Here were sketches of bridges, of foundations, of chimneys that did not smoke. And here, in a section marked Kakluuni, were the plans. Page after page of detailed diagrams, of airflow channels, of heat exchange chambers. There were notes in Finnish, a language Aino barely remembered, but the drawings were universal. They showed how the hot gases from a fire, instead of rushing up a chimney, could be guided on a long journey. Up a primary chamber, then down a secondary one, then up a third before finally exiting, stripped of their heat. The heat wasn't lost to the sky. It was absorbed by hundreds, thousands of pounds of stone and clay, which would then radiate it gently into the room for hours, for a whole day, from a single, short, hot fire. His father had never built one here. There was never the time, never the money for the fire bricks for the core. But he had planned it. The last entry, written in a shaky hand a month before he died, was in English. For Aino, the winters are cold, the wood is hard to get. This is the better way. Do not let them tell you otherwise. Trust the stone, trust the heat. It will keep you warm. Aino traced the words with his finger. He looked at the half-finished stove, its dark mass filling the room. It was more than a heater. It was a final conversation with his father. It was a legacy. He closed the journal. Tomorrow, he would begin hauling the stones for the second bell chamber. The work was the hardest he had ever known. His days began before dawn, when the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. He took the old cart and the mule his father had left him and traveled to the far end of his property, where a glacier had deposited a ridge of fieldstones centuries ago. He chose them one by one, looking for flat faces and manageable sizes, prying them from the Earth's grip. Each stone was a dead weight, a piece of the planet's skeleton he had to wrestle onto the cart. The mule strained, and Aino pushed from behind, his boots slipping in the mud. By the time he returned to the cabin, his back was a single throbbing ache, his hands scraped raw against the granite. He would unload the stones, stacking them carefully, then go back for another load. 2, sometimes 3 trips a day. The pile of raw material grew, a testament to his dogged persistence. Then came the mixing of the mortar. He dug the clay from the creek bed, a sticky, heavy mud that fought him for every shovelful. He hauled it up the bank in wooden buckets, his shoulders burning. He piled it, let it dry partially, then pulverized it with a heavy wooden mallet, turning the clods into a coarse powder. He did the same with sand from a deposit further downstream. He spent an entire day sharpening his scythe and cutting straw from the overgrown meadow, then another 2 days chopping it into short, inch-long fibers with a hatchet. The recipe was in the journal: 3 parts sand, 1 part clay, a half part of straw, and just enough water to make a stiff, workable paste. He mixed it with his hands and a hoe, turning it over and over, feeling for the right consistency. It was ancient, elemental work. His body became a machine fueled by bread and water and an unbending will. As the stove grew taller, it transformed from a mere pile into a structure. He used the precious fire bricks he'd spent his father's last dollars on to build the firebox at the base, a small, carefully constructed chamber designed for a fast, intensely hot fire. From the top of the firebox, he built the first flue, a channel that went straight up for 4 feet. This was the first bell. Then, the part that baffled Silas and the others, he built a second channel right beside the first, connected at the top but leading down, all the way to the base of the stove. The hot gas, his father's drawings explained, would rise in the first flue. Then, as it cooled slightly and was pushed by the hotter gas behind it, it would spill over the top and be forced to travel down the second flue, shedding its heat into the interior masonry walls all the way. At the bottom, it would enter a third flue that led up again and finally into the chimney pipe that exited through the roof. It was a labyrinth for heat. Abernathy's daughter, Ilara, sometimes walked along the creek, gathering late-season herbs. She was quiet and had a thoughtful way of looking at things, her eyes missing nothing. One afternoon she stopped, not at the doorway like the others, but 20 feet away, watching him work. She didn't offer pity or advice. She just watched as he lifted a heavy capstone into place, grunting with the effort. "Does it have a name?" she asked, her voice clear and calm. Aino, surprised, turned. He hadn't heard her approach. "My father called it a kakluni." "Kakluni," she repeated, tasting the word. "What does it mean?" "Tiled stove. In Finland, they cover them in beautiful ceramic tiles. I only have stone and clay." "You're building it from that book, aren't you?" she asked, nodding toward the cabin. "Mrs. Gable said your father left his notes." Aino nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a clay-caked arm. "He knew how." "Silas says the smoke will have nowhere to go," she said, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact. "He's wrong," Aino said. "The smoke gets cold. Cold smoke doesn't rise as well. It's happy to go down if you give it a path. All the heat stays in the stone." She considered this, her gaze moving over the immense structure. It was nearly 7 feet tall now, a solid, tapering column of gray stone and mortar that dominated the small room. He had started to build a bench into one side, a wide stone seat that would be warmed by the mass behind it. So you burn a fire for a short time, and the stones stay warm for a long time? For a day, Aino said. One fire in the morning, maybe one at night if it is very cold. A flicker of understanding, not dismissal, crossed her face. She looked at the stacks of firewood piled high against the far wall of his cabin, then at the much larger stacks beside Silas's and the other homesteads. Aino's pile was a quarter the size of his neighbor's. "You're not planning to be cold," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said, "I'm not." She gave him a small, genuine smile. "I hope it works, Aino. I truly do." She continued on her way, leaving Aino with a strange feeling of warmth that had nothing to do with fire. He watched her go, then turned back to his work, his movements a little lighter. The first snows came in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a stark warning. The valley grew quiet. The settlers focused on the last of the harvest, on banking their cabins with earth, on splitting and stacking the last of their firewood. The chorus of mockery against Aino had faded, replaced by a grim, knowing silence. The consensus was that the boy was a lost cause, and they would find out soon enough. Aino worked with a frantic urgency now. The outer shell was complete. The final task was to plaster the entire structure with a finish coat of fine clay and sand, sealing every tiny crack. He worked by lantern light late into the nights, his hands becoming numb with the cold, wet slurry. He troweled it on, smoothed it with a piece of wet leather, working his way from the top down. The stove became a single, monolithic object, pale and sculptural in the flickering light. It looked like something from an older world. When he was finally done, he cleaned his tools, his movements slow with exhaustion. His hands were a wreck of cracked skin and bloody knuckles. His back felt permanently bent. But the stove was finished. It stood 3 feet from the wall, 7 feet tall, 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep. An estimated 5 tons of stone and clay. A thermal battery. He let it cure for 2 weeks, building a tiny fire of twigs in it each day to help the massive amount of water in the mortar slowly evaporate. A damp, earthy smell filled the cabin. Otso would lie with his nose pointed toward the stove, sniffing the strange new scent. During this time, the weather turned. The sky took on a permanent leaden gray. The wind picked up, moaning through the pines, and the temperature began to fall, day by day. On the first day of November, the real cold arrived. The temperature overnight dropped to 10 degrees. In the morning, Aino saw the smoke pouring from his neighbor's chimneys, thick and black. They were stoking their iron stoves, feeding the hungry metal boxes that radiated intense heat in a small circle, but left the rest of the cabin frigid. They would have to feed those stoves all day and all night. Aino went to his woodpile. He selected 10 pieces of dry, split pine. Not large logs, but medium-sized pieces. He brought them inside and loaded them into the firebox, stacking them loosely as his father's journal instructed. He opened the damper to the chimney flue, lit a piece of birch bark, and ignited the kindling. The fire caught quickly. It roared. The sound was not the lazy crackle of an open hearth, but a contained, rushing inferno, like a blacksmith's forge. The small firebox and the tall, open flue above it created a powerful draft. All the energy of the wood was released in a torrent of flame and heat. He stood back and watched. There was no smoke in the room, not a wisp. The draft was pulling it all, every bit of it, up into the heart of the stove. He let the fire burn at maximum intensity. In just under an hour, the 10 logs were gone, reduced to a bed of glowing, white-hot coals. He closed the firebox door, and after a few more minutes, he closed the main chimney damper, sealing the entire system. The fire was over. but the work of the stove was just beginning. He placed his hand on the stone bench he had built into its side. It was barely warm. He felt a pang of doubt. Had Silas been right? Had he built a 5-ton folly? He busied himself with chores, trying to ignore the immense, silent object. An hour passed. He touched the bench again. It was warmer now, a pleasant, deep warmth that seemed to come from within the stone itself. Another hour passed. The entire surface of the stove, all the way to the top, was radiating a steady, gentle heat. The air in the cabin, which had been a damp 40 degrees, was slowly, perceptibly warming. By noon, the temperature inside was 65 degrees. The single window was clear of frost. Otso, who usually spent his days curled in a tight ball on Aino's cot, was stretched out languidly on the stone bench, his tail occasionally thumping in sleepy contentment. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 5 degrees. A plume of steam, not smoke, rose for a few minutes from Aino's chimney as the last of the hot gas cooled. And then, nothing. The chimneys of his neighbors, however, continued to belch smoke, devouring cords of wood. That night, Aino did not build a second fire. The stove was still warm. The cabin remained a comfortable 60 degrees all night long, while the temperature outside plummeted to 5 below zero. He slept soundly, for the first time without the nagging fear of the cold. The stove worked. His father was right. It worked. The first blizzard arrived a week later. It did not come with dramatic fury, but with a quiet, sinister stealth. The sky thickened, the wind died to an unnerving whisper, and then the snow began to fall, fine, dry crystals that hissed against the window pane. For 3 days it snowed, relentlessly. The world vanished under a blanket of white. The temperature dropped to 10 below. Then 20. Then on the 4th day, it settled at a terrifying 31 degrees below zero. The wind returned, howling, driving the snow into impassable drifts, sculpting the landscape into a white, frozen desert. The settlers called it the White Death, a storm that came not with a roar, but with a suffocating, absolute cold. Inside Aino's cabin, it was 70 degrees. The air was warm and still. Twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, he burned a small, hot fire for an hour. For the other 22 hours, the massive stone stove radiated its gentle, persistent heat. The stone bench was a popular spot for Otso, but Aino found himself sitting there too, leaning against the warm plaster, reading his father's journal. The difference between the inside of his cabin and the outside world was over 100 degrees. It was a pocket of summer in the heart of a polar vortex. He had enough wood to last for 2 months. On the 5th day of the storm, he heard a desperate pounding on his door. He pulled it open against the wind, a blast of Arctic air and stinging snow flooding the room. It was Mrs. Gable, her face pale and drawn, her shawl crusted with ice. Behind her stood her husband and their 2 small children, shivering violently, their faces blue with cold. "Aino," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "Please, our fire. We can't keep it going. The wood is gone. It's so cold. The children." "Come in," Aino said simply, stepping back. They stumbled inside, their eyes wide as the warmth enveloped them. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a soft, pervasive warmth that seemed to be in the very air they breathed. Mr. Gable stared at the stove, at its placid, whitewashed surface. There was no fire, no glow, no sound. "But where is the fire?" he asked, bewildered. "It was done this morning," Aino said, closing the door and bolting it against the storm. He handed them blankets, though they hardly needed them. The little girl, no more than 5 years old, crept toward the stove and placed her small, red hands on the stone bench. A look of profound relief washed over her face. She climbed onto it and curled up, falling asleep almost instantly. Mrs. Gable began to weep, quiet tears of exhaustion and gratitude. An hour later, there was another knock. It was two more families, their wood piles exhausted, their cabins now as cold inside as out. Aino let them in. The small cabin was becoming crowded, but no one complained. They huddled together, marveling at the impossible warmth. The last to arrive was Silas. He did not knock. He fell against the door, and Aino found him there when he went to check the latch. The old trapper was covered in snow, his beard a mass of ice. He was alone. Aino and Mr. Gable helped him inside and sat him on a stool. He was shaking, not just from cold, but from something deeper. He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors, at the sleeping children. His gaze fell upon the stove. For a long moment, he just stared at the impossible mountain of warm stone. His own cabin, with its big, efficient iron stove, was now 0 degrees inside. The fire had died 12 hours ago. He had burned through a winter's worth of wood in 5 days. He had been so sure of his experience, so certain of Aino's folly. He raised his eyes to meet Aino's. The boy wasn't gloating. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet, steady calm. "Boy," Silas said, his voice a broken croak. I was wrong." He looked at the stove again, at the structure he had mocked. Will you teach me?" Aino nodded. "When the storm breaks." The storm raged for 2 more days. 21 people found shelter in Aino's small cabin. They shared what little food they had. They told stories. They slept in shifts. And through it all, the stove kept them warm. It was the silent, beating heart of their survival, radiating its steady, life-giving heat, a monument to a father's love and a son's stubborn faith. When the sky finally cleared and the wind died, the valley was a changed place. The silence was profound. The landscape was buried, unrecognizable. But in the center of the devastation, one small cabin stood as a beacon of impossible warmth, its chimney sending out a brief, confident puff of steam into the crystalline air, and then falling silent. When spring finally broke the winter's hold, the valley was reborn. The great melt revealed the scars of the blizzard, collapsed roofs, ruined stores of food, the graves of livestock that had frozen in their barns. But the community had not been broken. It had been forged anew in the warmth of Aino's cabin. Silas was the first. As soon as the ground was soft enough to dig, he was at Aino's door, his hat in his hands. "The clay," he said. "You said it came from the creek. Show me." Aino did. He didn't lecture or boast. He simply walked with Silas to the creek bed, showed him the right layer to dig, the one with the best plasticity. He showed him the sand deposit, how to test the grain. He brought out his father's journal and opened it on the table. The 2 men, the old, weathered trapper and the quiet young homesteader, sat with their heads together, poring over the intricate drawings. Silas, who could read the land and the sky, struggled with the diagrams, but he had a practical, 3-dimensional mind. "So the heat goes up, hits the roof here," he'd say, tracing a line with a calloused finger. "And the push from the fire behind it shoves it over and down this other path, like water over a fall." "Yes," Aino would say, "exactly like that." Mr. Abernathy came next. He rode up not on his fine horse, but walking, leading the mule which was laden with sacks. He did not apologize with words. He unloaded the sacks at Aino's feet. Fire bricks. Dozens of them. "For the others," he said, his voice gruff, avoiding Aino's eyes. "I'll be wanting one myself, before next winter. I'll pay for your time." "I don't want your money," Aino said. I want your help. We'll need to haul a lot of stone." Abernathy looked at his clean hands, then at Eino's. He slowly nodded. "All right, son. All right." That summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of construction. It was a communal effort. Under Eino's quiet guidance, the men worked together. They formed a line from the creek bed, passing buckets of clay and sand. They ventured to the glacial ridge with carts and wagons, helping each other pry the heaviest stones from the ground. Eino moved from homestead to homestead, a quiet consultant. He wasn't a leader in the traditional sense. He didn't give rousing speeches or bark orders. He simply showed them. He would kneel and help a man lay a difficult course of fire bricks, or take a trowel and demonstrate the right way to smooth the mortar. He shared his father's knowledge freely, and in doing so, he wove the community together with something stronger than mud and straw. He built 4 more stoves that summer, one for Silas, one for the Gables, one for Abernathy, and one in the small schoolhouse that Alara had been struggling to keep warm. Alara was often there, bringing water to the men, her presence a quiet source of encouragement. She would watch Eino, the way he moved with patient economy, the way he could solve a problem of angles and weight with a few quiet moments of study. Her respect had deepened into a quiet affection that mirrored his own. One evening, as he was finishing the plaster on the schoolhouse stove, she stayed behind after the others had left. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor. "My father says you've changed this valley," she said softly. "The stove did," he corrected. "No," she insisted. "You did. You didn't hoard the knowledge. You gave it away." She stepped closer and touched the smooth, cool surface of the new stove. "My father, he's different. He talks about BTUs and thermal mass now. Silas argues with him about the best kind of clay. It's all they discuss at the store." She smiled. "You've given them a new gospel." Eino felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with masonry. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught in her hair. For the first time, his words were not about stone or fire. "Your father still has a fine horse," he said. Ilara laughed, a sound like clear water. "He does." "Maybe on Sunday," Eino said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "You would like to ride with me. My mule is slow, but he is steady." Her smile widened. "I would like that very much, Eino." The seasons turned. The next winter was just as cold, but it was not feared. The settlement was ready. Every morning, a dozen chimneys would send up their brief, efficient plumes of steam, and then fall quiet. Inside the cabins, it was warm. Children did their lessons in the schoolhouse without shivering. Families gathered in the evenings without having to huddle around a single ravenous iron box. The valley was safe. The knowledge had been passed forward. Eino and Alara were married the following spring, in a ceremony by the creek. Silas stood as Eino's witness, and Mr. Abernathy, his hands still rough from hauling stone, gave the bride away. Years passed. The settlement grew into a town, but it grew differently. The houses were modest, but they were warm. Architects and engineers from cities came to study the Heikkinen stoves, writing articles for scientific journals about the rediscovered principles of the Finnish Contraflow masonry heater. Eino, who never sought recognition, would patiently explain the drawings in his father's journal, which was now worn and soft with use. He and Alara raised 3 children in the small cabin on the rise, which now had 2 more rooms added on. But the original stove remained the heart of the home. Otso grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his movements stiff. He spent most of his days on the warm stone bench, his favorite place in the world. One cold winter morning, Aino came in from his chores to find him lying there, still and peaceful. He had not woken up. His long watch was over. Aino carried his old friend, wrapped in a blanket, to the top of the small hill behind the cabin, the one that overlooked the town. He buried him under a tall pine tree, in a spot where you could see all the chimneys. He placed a simple, flat stone on the grave. He did not weep, but he stood there for a long time as the snow began to fall, one hand resting on the cold stone, a silent goodbye to his first and most faithful believer. Decades passed. Aino's hair turned the color of ash. His hands, though gnarled with arthritis, still knew the feel of stone and mortar. He became the town's quiet patriarch, a living legend who was most often found sitting on the warm bench of his original stove, watching his grandchildren play on the floor. He saw the world change. He saw a railroad come through, and eventually, automobiles. But the stoves remained. They were too simple, too efficient, too reliable to be replaced. They were the valley's soul, built of its own earth. In his final years, he was fond of sitting by the stove on cold nights, the room lit only by a single lamp, his father's journal open on his lap. He could no longer read the fine script, but he knew the pages by heart. He would run his hand over the smooth, warm plaster of the stove, feeling the gentle, radiant heat that had saved them all so long ago. He had fulfilled his father's last wish. He had kept them warm. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the bed his father had built, in the cabin kept warm by the stove he had created. He was 91 years old. The whole town attended his funeral. They buried him on the hill, next to Otso, under the tall pine. They placed a large, handsome stone of gray granite to mark the spot. Ilara, herself now old and frail but with the same clear light in her eyes, had chosen the words. They were carved deep and plain. Eino Heikkinen, 1861 to 1952. He kept us warm. From that hill, you could see the whole town spread out below. And on that cold, clear winter day, as the sun began to set, one by one, the chimneys on the rooftops began to send their brief, confident puffs of steam into the twilight air. A testament, a legacy, a promise kept. And in the center of it all, the original cabin still stood, a monument of logs and stone, its windows dark, but its heart, the great masonry stove, forever holding a remnant of the last fire, a quiet, enduring warmth.